Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
What would it be like to suddenly discover that your life has an incredibly meaningful place in the story of the entire universe? That you're not just some kind of cosmic accident, but might have a very specific role to play? What would that mean for you?
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
The impact that Charles Darwin had on the Western world is really pretty hard to underestimate. I mean, it's still the prevailing theory of human origins taught in classrooms to this day. Even though there was actually very little original material in Darwin's thinking, at least when it came to the idea of evolution, he still gets credit for assembling it in such a way that most people started thinking in terms of survival of the fittest. And unless you've been hiding under a rock, you know the basics of what Darwin taught. Organisms change and adapt over time, and the very best mutations, the ones that prove to be beneficial, give some creatures distinct advantages. So those creatures take over the gene pool. And there's a bit of irony in using the word creature too, because, well, what's a creature? It's something that's created. But I digress. I've always found it curious that Darwin's first essay on this subject came out in 1844, right at the end of the Second Great Awakening, and in the same year that a Baptist preacher named William Miller was generating an awful lot of interest in the subject of the Second Coming. This was a time of deep spiritual revival here in America, and even though Darwin was in England, I can't help but think that the widespread adoption of his theory at that time might not be a coincidence. Somehow, like everything else, his thoughts were somewhat shaped by the times in which he lived. Here in the United States, the 19th century was a very unsettled time. Not only did we have the Second Great Awakening, which scholars usually date from the 1790s through the 1840s, but a few years after that, the dream that was America was suddenly torn in half by a brutal civil war that took hundreds of thousands of lives. I've seen estimates from 600 to 720,000. Of course, the impact of that conflict is really hard to overestimate. And in many ways, Americans are still living in the wake of the Civil War. But as Randall Fuller points out, the Civil War was not the only major upheaval going on in American culture at that time. One single copy of Darwin's book on the origin of species had a very big influence on the American mind. Here's how Mr. Fuller describes it. One copy of The Origin made a disproportionately large impact on American culture. That copy, which today resides at Harvard University, was sent by its authors to Asa Gray, a botanist who soon championed the new theory to general and scientific audiences throughout America. So, in other words, it took just one academic with a single copy of Darwin's book to make his theory take root all across this nation. It almost sounds like one of those stories you hear about missionaries who smuggle a single copy of the Bible into a forbidden zone, and then that Bible launches a huge revival. I would argue that Darwin's work also triggered a spiritual revival of sorts, but from where I sit, it was the wrong kind. And actually, the word revival isn't really the right word. I should probably call it a spiritual revolution. And I know there are people listening who will not like the idea that Darwin was some kind of spiritual leader because, man, he was obviously a man of secular thought and science. But to suggest that Darwin's theory didn't have a spiritual impact, that's either dishonest or naive. For starters, he was challenging the traditional anthropology and cosmology of the entire Judeo-Christian West. Our understanding of who we are as human beings shifted under Darwin's tutelage. Instead of thinking about ourselves as creatures made in the image of God, we started to believe that we were the product of time plus chance. And of course, the way you choose to live can be profoundly influenced by your understanding of who you are and where you come from. What happened when Darwin's work took root is a shift away from thinking about humanity as the apex of biological life. Up to his point, most people believed that humanity was the point of creation, frankly, the reason for this planet. In fact, there were people who believed that you and I are the very center of the whole universe, not just metaphorically speaking, but literally. They believed the Earth was located at the very center of the cosmos. Of course, there's nothing in the Bible to affirm that, but the way we tend to think, being placed at the center of something, like the center of the universe, is a way of emphasizing its importance. That's why we got a little pushback when people like Galileo or Copernicus started to ask some really good questions. Church leaders, and by no means all of them, but some church leaders were afraid that telling people the Earth was not at the center would be a demotion for the human race. But then after we accepted those ideas, Darwin came along and said that maybe we aren't the apex, the point of biology either. We'd always believed, always sensed that human beings are somehow different from the animals. But Darwin's work now said we were nothing but animals. Successful animals, to be sure, but still just animals. And now we were no longer special, no longer made in the image of God, and we were no longer the point of this world's existence. Now, oddly enough, in recent years, there's been some scientific pushback on the idea that you and I are not special, because there's now a very small but growing movement that preaches something known as biocentrism. And it's a return to the idea that the universe appears to exist for our benefit. At least one science author I've read makes the case that parts of this universe appear to respond to our observation, as if they know we're watching. You'll find this in the world of quantum physics, where we've discovered that some tiny, tiny particles have no reliable location until we measure them. In other words, the behavior of quantum particles actually changes when we're looking. How do they know we're looking? It's kind of mind-blowing. But it's also not really what we're driving at today. Right now, our primary interest is to think about the difference between this new Darwinian paradigm and the way the Bible talks about the importance and the nature of humanity. And what we're going to look at isn't really anchored in the tension between creation and evolution, because there have been plenty of discussions about that. What I want to explore is how our understanding of who we are impacts the way we live. Does it make a difference if you have a noble concept of what a human is versus the radical devaluation of humanity that came through Darwin? So, if you've got a copy of the Bible somewhere in your house, you might want to grab it, because we're going to look at a few key passages from the book of Genesis. And while I'm obviously going to read them to you, you're still going to get more out of this if you follow along. How does the Bible position humanity? What does it say about who we are, what we're worth, and why we seem to be broken? Of course, it's an enormous subject, and there's no way we're going to cover it in the time we have, but I do want to give you some things to think about, and hopefully you'll discover a path toward a more authentic human existence. The disciples of Darwin would tell you that an authentic human life is rooted in basic biology. As long as you're eating, sleeping, drinking, reproducing, as long as you're functioning as a basic biological unit, then that's the authentic life. There's no more to it. Of course, some of them will admit that a purely materialistic view of the universe can rob your life of any transcendency. It takes away your meaning. And so you'll find any number of them trying to instill a sense of wonder into their new cosmology, suggesting that the so-called miracle of evolution is the meaning of life. Just count yourself lucky to be here, and that's all the wonder you need. But what I've noticed is that most people find that pretty empty. I'll be right back after this.
Hey, Shawn Boonstra here. Did you know you can watch Authentic every week? Yep. Just search for Authentic with Shawn Boonstra on YouTube. It's that easy. Catch new episodes every week during our regular seasons and watch for free. And while you're at it, would you tell one or two people about the show? Thanks for your support.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
When the Western world entered the 19th century, it was still popular to believe, in harmony with the first chapter of the book of Romans, that by studying nature, you could discover the truth about God. Science, as you and I think about it, didn't really exist yet. Yeah, the scientific method, that was already there, and it was starting to bear some remarkable fruit. But the idea of a professional career scientist who takes measurements all day long, that didn't really exist yet. Instead, people who were interested in studying the natural world did it under two broad categories, either natural history or natural philosophy. Natural history was the study of essential facts. That's the part where you explore the world and take all those measurements. Natural philosophy was the study of the laws of the universe that govern the facts. The famous astronomer William Herschel summed it up by saying that he thought there was, quote, a power and intelligence that held the natural world together, pulling it all together, in all departments, through which one spirit reigns and one method of inquiry applies. There was this widespread understanding that made studying the natural world something of a religious exercise. And of course, to study God is ultimately to study yourself, because the Scriptures teach that you and I were made in God's image. Not that we are equivalent to God, but we are the product of His heart and mind. To study the natural world was like studying your own ancestry. If God made this place and He made me, then what can I learn about the nature of what it means to be human? But then the new survival of the fittest paradigm kind of stripped the meaning away from those studies. Now we started to study the world from a purely mechanistic perspective. The universe still looked like a carefully organized machine, but now without an intelligence behind it. So what in the world did it mean? The appearance of design, they said, was just a coincidence. Give the universe enough time, and eventually the random activity of particles will land on just the right formula and give us all of this. But now let's consider the way the book of Genesis describes the birth of humanity, because it's really kind of remarkable. I know that some of you think Genesis is just another ancient myth, a feeble attempt to explain who we are that was produced by superstitious people, like the origin myths of Egypt, Babylon, and Greece. But anybody who actually reads Genesis seriously quickly discovers that it doesn't read like those other myths, not even a little bit. For example, there is no attempt in the Bible to explain where God comes from. He's just there in the opening verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. By contrast, in the ancient pagan myths, you get a much different picture. There's almost always an explanation of where the gods came from. Part of the reason the book of Genesis was written was to counter those pagan myths, because that's the world that Moses and the nation of Israel were living in at the time. Then in Genesis 1:26, we find the Bible's account of where we as humans come from. Listen to what it says, and I'm going to read several verses. This is important. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him, male and female He created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Now here's what I want you to notice, the big idea. There are 6 days of creation activity packed into the 25 verses that come before this. And now the narrative slows way down, as if it's anticipating something big, the pinnacle of creation. It's almost like God is about to put that little bride and groom on top of a wedding cake, as if we are the point of everything that comes before this moment. God's already cracked the eggs, mixed the batter, baked it in the oven, covered it with icing, and now He's suddenly ready to place us in our new home. The Genesis account is clearly anthropocentric, making humanity, after God Himself, the star of creation. And what's really remarkable is the fact that God appears to be taking a huge, huge risk. I mean, just think about this. If you were in charge of the universe, would you put us in charge of anything? Knowing what you know about our essential human character, would you actually put us in charge of a planet? But that's exactly what God did. Let them have dominion, He said. Dominion, of course, would imply that you and I have the ability to make meaningful decisions. After all, that's what it means to be in charge. If you have a factory run by robots, it's fair to say that the robots are functioning and getting the job done, but there's really no sense in which you could say the robots are running the place or that they would have dominion. Although there are people now wondering if AI isn't going to give us machines that have the gift of consciousness. Personally, I don't think that's ever going to happen. You and I, though, were given the gift of consciousness. We have the ability to live above our basic animal instinct because we have the capacity to consider moral and ethical questions, something that appears to differentiate us from the animals. We communicate with logical propositions. We can anticipate the long-range future and make plans about it, even though our thought process is really very tragically flawed and we often botch it, leading to unintended consequences. Kind of like that brilliant idea somebody had to bring cane toads to Australia. The idea was that cane toads could control the beetles who were destroying the sugarcane crop. But instead of controlling the pests, the toads themselves to this day are an uncontrollable pest. We don't always think clearly. But all that aside, the fact that we can consider such things really makes us different from the animals. We've discovered that animals can be very intelligent. Some of them can even use language. But what we never seem to find them doing is grappling with logical propositions. And the Genesis story seems to agree with that. You and I are fundamentally different, made in the image of God. And from this point in the story forward, the Bible really becomes the story of the Creator interacting with the human race. It's not really the story of God intervening in nature, even though we'll find a few accounts where He does change the weather or floods the earth or even makes time appear to stop. But all of those things are still the story of God interacting with us. And He's redirecting the natural world at a particular moment because of our needs or because of our behavior. It might be useful to think about this passage in Genesis as the opening credits to a very big movie, one of those big 3-hour epics. Back in the old days, you might remember when people had more patience, the opening credits were just about as long and detailed as the closing credits. Before the story ever started, you knew who directed the movie, you knew who the actors were, maybe even some of the plot. And then when the story begins, you expect that story to follow a logical course. It's not going to be a series of unrelated, random incidents that have nothing to do with each other. It's going to follow a plot line. It's going to take you somewhere. And that's kind of how the human race appears in the book of Genesis. It's setting the table for a long and meaningful story about the nature of humanity, our redemption, and our relationship to the Creator. This is where you come from, the Bible says, and it creates a level of expectation and teases you with some really good questions. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? Why exactly did God put us here? What is the purpose of human life? There's a lot of philosophy buried in these opening chapters of Genesis because they deal with just about every big question the human race has ever asked. And now it's time for a break, so I'll be right back after this.
Got kids? Get Discovery Mountain, a free weekly audio adventure to build their faith. Discovery Mountain! It's a place where the air is clear. So clear you can almost hear your imagination. A world of Bible-based wonder for kids everywhere to grow their faith and get closer to Jesus Christ. Discovery Mountain. Free weekly content that'll inspire and engage. Listen anywhere you get your favorite podcasts or at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Just a few moments ago, I mentioned this idea that God took an incredible risk when He put us in charge of this place because He created us with the ability to choose. Remember, to have dominion is to have meaningful choice, and God was willing to risk the fact that we might actually make the wrong choice or even turn against Him. Why would He do that? Well, because if you don't have a choice, it's impossible to have an actual relationship. And so in the Bible's account of human origins, it almost feels like God pauses to take this deep breath, and then He says with great expectation, "Let us make man in our image." It's the moment He took a chance on us. It's the moment He took a chance on you. So let's imagine again that this is the opening sequence to a major dramatic movie, like The 10 Commandments or Gone with the Wind. And instead of thinking about the Garden of Eden, let's think about you. Because if this book is right, and I'm convinced it is, then you've got to expect that the whole narrative is unfolding the way it does for a very specific reason. This is not the story of random chance. Some modern Darwinists might explain your existence as a coincidence or even a cosmic mistake, but the author of this story was writing an account with a definite direction and a definite purpose. This is not going to be a collection of random, meaningless thoughts. And of course, you and I make our appearance toward the very end of this story. And what I want you to consider is the possibility that you are not just an extra, some random person pulled into the story to help fill out some crowd scene. Instead, consider the possibility that the writer of this story actually planned for you. Maybe your name's even in the opening credits. It's an idea I've been thinking about based on something you find in the book of Jeremiah, where God tells the weeping prophet that he planned for his existence. Here's what it says. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Now, of course, Jeremiah played a major role in the story of God's interaction with humanity. You might even say he's one of the leading men. But why shouldn't you be? Who's to say that your existence is an unimportant sidebar to this incredible drama? I actually got the idea for comparing human existence to a screenplay from the Lutheran preacher Helmut Thielicke, who had a remarkable and poetic gift for helping people contemplate the major themes of the Bible. And at one point, this is what he wrote. Can I tread the stage of my life without facing the question, what am I really going to play? Or do I propose to go blindly on stage and begin to babble away, depending on the prompting of the moment to tell me what to say? If that is so, then when the curtain of our life finally falls at our last hour, we can only make our exit with the vapid feeling that it was all a mistake. We have indulged in a lot of foolish talk. We have turned somersaults, lounged on sofas, rummaged in filing cabinets. We have engaged in quarrelsome dialogues and even played a variety of love scenes. But it was all a disconnected tutti-frutti and had no direction and no style. So let me ask you this. What difference would it make if you discovered that you're a leading role? Your life is not an accident. What if you knew there was a divine drama being played out on this planet and that God has a role for you? How would that affect your decision-making process? How would that impact the decisions you're making right now today? Consider this statement found in Hebrews chapter 12, where the author creates this incredible metaphor, suggesting that you and I are standing at the end of a long line of faithful people who have already played their parts. He says, Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Now, of course, the Bible also tells us the dead aren't actually watching us. Ecclesiastes 9 says they have no more share in all that is done under the sun. So, Hebrews is really just a metaphor, and it's telling us to think of life as if you and I have just entered an arena to compete, and the entire human race from the past is watching to see how we run. William Shakespeare once said something really similar, using the theater instead of a stadium. You probably remember this from high school. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. Now, I really don't know if Shakespeare was the inspiration for Pastor Thielicke, but that is a useful metaphor. You are going to get one moment on the stage of life, and you should be asking yourself if you're playing your part the way it was written. If the Bible is accurate, and you and I are actually here by design, then you've got to expect that your moment on stage is just as important as anybody else's. You've got a choice. Will your life be part of the Creator's narrative or not? I'll be right back right after this.
Retirement planning can be a stressful process, but it doesn't have to be. The friendly people at the Voice of Prophecy can walk you through the entire process and explain all of your options based on your specific needs. Whether you'd like to set up a trust for income or make a gift that will benefit your loved ones and change lives through the Voice of Prophecy, we're here to help. To learn more, call 1-800-348-5993.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
All right, I'm looking at the clock on the wall, and I'm seriously running out of time yet again. But let me just read you the rest of that passage from Hebrews chapter 12. Right after the author says that you and I are competing in the arena of humanity, taking our turn in front of our ancestors, he tells us how you might be able to do this successfully. Listen to this. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. You know, in another spot in the New Testament, Peter actually suggests that even the angels are watching us. They're studying how God interacts with us. They're trying to understand the character of God better. The plan of salvation, they've been audience to that as well. But now let's head back to Genesis, where we find that awful historical moment when the human race rejected its original commission and compromised its moral fidelity. It's the fall of humanity. And at that moment, what does God do? He promises Messiah, a man who would be the only example of a truly authentic, uncompromised, unsinful life. If you want to learn your lines for your part, God says, if you want to play your part the way that I wrote it, then have a look at my son. Look at Jesus. Pattern yourself after that. So now you and I are faced with a choice. We can live a meaningless life. Well, the way it's been proposed to us since we were in high school, it doesn't mean anything. You're just an animal. You can live a meaningless life. You can allow the arbitrary winds of fortune to drive you from one pointless moment of living to the next, and it just never means anything. Or we can refuse to learn the plot, refuse to study what our role should be in this world. We can wander out onto the stage of life and leave the audience wondering why in the world the casting director included us. Why would God put that person here? Or we can find our place in the grand narrative by studying this book, reading it for real, not just reading what people say about it, but reading it for yourself to discover that our lives really do have purpose. You have a role to play. And it's not inconsequential, it's important. God took a chance when He created us. And at this very moment, right now, as you're listening to my voice, you need to know He's also taking a chance on you. You can choose to play your life in such a way that nobody will ever believe that you know the author of this book. Or you can choose to play the part so well that everybody looks at your life and says, you know what? That makes sense. That's how you would expect a real God to write this story. And just in case you think it doesn't matter, maybe consider just how often you've heard somebody point to irrational or evil behavior and say, how in the world could God ever allow that to happen? Tell me you've never done that. So what would it look like if you knew, you believed that you were here on purpose? No matter what your past might suggest, no matter what other people have told you, what if your existence could become one of those human lives that everybody marvels at? The kind of life that actually dares people to believe that none of us is really here by accident. What if you spent every day anticipating the moment when God Himself will put that laurel wreath on your head and speak those incredible words, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant"? Imagine what that would be like. So maybe go get yourself a copy of this book and see if it isn't going to help you memorize your lines. Thanks for joining me. I'm Shawn Boonstra. This has been another episode of Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.